The clock on the dashboard reads 8 in the morning. Outside the windshield, there is nothing but black. No glow on the horizon. No hint of a sunrise that is still hours from ever happening. For a driver parked at the edge of the Arctic Ocean, morning and midnight look exactly the same. And the only way to know which one it is comes from a wristwatch, not the sky. This is the part of trucking almost nobody outside the industry ever hears about. Most people assume the hardest thing about driving in Alaska's far north is the cold. The cold matters, and it can kill a person who is unprepared for it. But ask the drivers who run this route year after year, and many of them will tell you something different. The coldest part of the job is not always the worst part. The darkest part is. Past the Arctic Circle, during the heart of winter, the sun does not rise. Not for an afternoon, not for a week. For the drivers based out of Fairbanks who haul freight up the Dalton Highway to the oil camps at Deadhorse and Prudhoe Bay, there is a stretch of the calendar, more than 50 days long, when the sun simply does not climb above the horizon at all. It is not an exaggeration, and it is not a gimmick used to make winter sound worse than it is. It is basic geography. At roughly 70 degrees north latitude, the tilt of the planet keeps that part of Alaska tucked in shadow for almost 2 months straight. And the people who keep freight moving through that stretch are not snowed in waiting it out. They are out there every day, doing the same job they would do in July, except July never comes. Most people, when the days get short, simply adjust their schedule a little and complain about the early sunset. Truck drivers on the North Slope corridor don't get that luxury. The freight on this route is not optional. It is fuel, parts, food, drilling equipment, and construction material headed toward oil operations that do not pause for winter. ConocoPhillips and BP-operated fields on Alaska's North Slope run continuously, 12 months a year, and the trucks that supply them are part of the reason those operations stay running. Carriers like Carlisle Transportation, Linden Transport, and Alaska West Express have spent decades building their entire business model around exactly this kind of work, sending drivers north on a highway most of the country has never heard of, into a polar night most of the country has never experienced. So picture the drive itself. It begins in Fairbanks, the last real city before the wilderness takes over, and follows the Dalton Highway nearly 400 miles north, climbing through the Brooks Range at Atigun Pass, the highest highway crossing in the state, before dropping onto the open expanse of Alaska's North Slope, and finally reaching Deadhorse. The road itself has an unusual history that most people who picture this route never think about. It was built in 1974 in under 6 months as a haul road to support construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And for 2 decades afterward, it stayed closed to ordinary travelers, used almost exclusively by oil field trucks. It didn't fully open to the public until 1994. Even today, the freight that justified building the road in the first place is still the freight that justifies keeping it plowed and maintained through a winter most highway departments elsewhere would simply shut down for. In summer, this is a long but visually stunning drive. In the depth of winter, with the sun gone for the day, the week, and the month, it becomes something else entirely. The headlights become the only light source for hours at a stretch, carving a narrow tunnel out of a darkness that presses in from every direction. And the darkness isn't always absolute. Most people picture polar night as pitch black around the clock, but that's not quite accurate. Even with the sun never climbing above the horizon, there's often a faint blue-gray glow around midday, a brief window of civil twilight without an actual sunrise, just enough light to make out the shape of the road ahead without ever calling it daytime. Drivers describe it as the sky teasing them with almost light for an hour or two before sliding back into full dark, a daily reminder of how close they are to a sunrise that simply isn't going to happen. Most people's first assumption is that the body simply adjusts to that kind of darkness the way it adjusts to anything else, given enough time. That assumption is only partly true, and the part that's wrong is the part nobody warns you about. Human biology was not built for a sky that never lightens. Inside the brain, a structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus uses light hitting the retina to set the body's internal clock. The same internal clock that controls when melatonin gets released and when a person naturally starts feeling drowsy or alert. Take away the light cue entirely, for weeks at a time, and that internal clock starts drifting. Sleep researchers and physicians who study circadian rhythms have documented this for decades in Arctic communities, and Alaska's own health agencies have tracked elevated rates of seasonal mood disruption tied to extended winter darkness, often referred to as seasonal affective disorder. For a long-haul driver, that drift isn't an abstract medical concept. It's the difference between feeling sharp behind the wheel and feeling like the middle of the night has somehow lasted for 6 weeks. Here is where the obvious assumption breaks down even further. Most people would guess that constant darkness simply makes sleeping easier, since darkness is what triggers sleep to begin with. Drivers who've spent years on this route say the opposite often happens. Without sunrise and sunset acting as anchor points, day blurs into day. A 10-hour rest period, taken at what the clock calls 2 in the afternoon, feels exactly the same as one taken at 2 in the morning, because outside the truck, nothing has changed to tell the body otherwise. That sameness is disorienting in a way that occasional bad weather isn't. Weather passes. The dark does not for weeks. This is where federal regulation and human biology end up tangled together in a way that matters more on this route than almost anywhere else in the country. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's hours of service rules require commercial drivers to take at least 10 consecutive hours off duty after up to 11 hours of driving inside a 14-hour on-duty window, with drivers permitted to split that rest using the sleeper berth provision. Typically a minimum 7-hour block in the berth combined with a separate off-duty period. Those rules exist to fight fatigue, and they work, but they were written assuming a driver's body has some natural reference point for night and day. On the Dalton Highway in January, that reference point disappears completely, and drivers are left building their rest schedule almost entirely by clock and discipline rather than instinct. That's where the hidden knowledge of this profession starts to show itself. The kind of detail that almost never makes it into a conversation about trucking, unless you're talking to someone who has actually lived it. Veteran North Slope drivers don't wait for their body to tell them it's time to sleep, because on this route, it often won't. They build a fixed schedule and defend it like it's part of the job itself, going to the sleeper berth at the same clock time every single day, regardless of how awake or tired they happen to feel in that moment. Many keep a small portable light therapy lamp in the cab, the same kind of device used to treat seasonal mood disruption, set to a bright white light in the range of 10,000 lux, and they use it deliberately during their planned waking hours to help convince a confused internal clock that it really is daytime, even though the world outside the windshield disagrees. It's a strange and quietly clever piece of equipment to find sitting on a sleeper cab dashboard. But for drivers who've learned the hard way what weeks of total darkness can do to focus and mood, it's become as routine as a tire pressure gauge. The irony, longtime Arctic drivers point out, is that summer creates almost the exact opposite problem and demands almost the exact opposite fix. A few months after the polar night ends, the same stretch of road experiences the midnight sun, with daylight stretching across nearly the entire 24-hour clock. Drivers who need to sleep at what their schedule calls 10 at night, with the sun still sitting fully above the horizon, often hang blackout curtains across every window of the sleeper berth, turning the cab into an artificial midnight in the middle of actual daylight. Winter and summer on this route ask drivers to manufacture, by hand, the exact thing the sky refuses to provide. In January, they manufacture daylight. In June, they manufacture night. Few people outside the cab ever realize that the same driver, on the same truck, is fighting two completely opposite battles depending on the season, using nothing but curtains and a lamp. None of this happens in isolation from the cold, either. And the two challenges compound each other in ways that catch newer drivers off guard. Diesel fuel itself begins to gel as temperatures drop, with paraffin wax crystals forming inside standard fuel blends and clogging filters long before a tank actually runs dry. Truck stops and fuel depots along the corridor carry winterized Arctic-grade diesel specifically blended to resist that gelling, often by mixing in the lighter, more cold-tolerant number 1 diesel as temperatures fall. A routine practice the industry simply calls winterizing the fuel. Drivers also carry fuel additives as backup, because a fuel line failure in the dark, dozens of miles from the nearest help, is not a minor inconvenience. It's a serious emergency to avoid running the main engine all night just for heat, which burns fuel and adds wear. Many trucks on this route are equipped with diesel-fired auxiliary heating units, often called bunk heaters, built by companies like Webasto and Espar, which warm the sleeper berth using a fraction of the fuel an idling engine would consume. It's a quiet piece of engineering most passengers in a regular car will never see, solving a problem that only exists because the alternative, sleeping cold at -30 or -40 with darkness outside for hours on end, simply isn't survivable as a long-term plan. The cold and the dark create a third problem most outsiders have never even heard the name of. At extremely low temperatures, the moisture in vehicle exhaust and human breath can freeze almost instantly into tiny ice crystals suspended in the air, a phenomenon Alaskans call ice fog. Around truck stops, generator yards, and idling engines, that fog can settle into a thick, low haze that swallows headlights almost as completely as the polar night does, stacking one visibility problem directly on top of another. A driver pulling into a rest area at Coldfoot in January may find their own headlights and the lights of the building ahead both smothered by a fog made of nothing but frozen breath. And learning to creep through that hanging haze at a walking pace is its own quietly essential skill, one that has nothing to do with snow or ice on the road itself. Communication breaks down out here in a way that surprises people used to constant cell signal. For long stretches of the Dalton Highway, there is no cell coverage at all, and drivers rely on CB radios to talk truck to truck, calling out road conditions, wildlife on the highway, or a vehicle pulled over in trouble. It's an old-fashioned system kept alive specifically because nothing more modern reliably works out there. And during the darkest weeks of winter, that radio chatter becomes one of the only forms of regular human contact a driver has for the better part of a shift. Passing trucks flash their lights or radio a quick check-in, a small ritual of acknowledgement between strangers who understand, without needing to say it, exactly what kind of stretch of road and season they're both out here dealing with. Inside the cab itself, the polar night creates a problem that has nothing to do with the road at all. Cabin fever, the restless, closed-in feeling that comes from spending mandated rest hours inside the same small sleeper berth with nothing outside the window worth looking at. Drivers who've adapted well to this route talk about treating their own body almost like a piece of equipment that needs scheduled maintenance, deliberately building short stretches of movement, stretching, or simple bodyweight exercise into their routine during waking hours. Not for fitness in the usual sense, but specifically to counteract the sluggishness that comes from a body that's confused about whether it's supposed to be alert or asleep. What rarely gets said out loud, but sits underneath almost every conversation with drivers who run this route for years rather than just one winter, is how much the isolation itself becomes its own quiet weight. The Dalton Highway sees only a fraction of the traffic of an ordinary interstate. Outside of Coldfoot, there are stretches of more than 100 miles without services of any kind. Add weeks of darkness on top of that distance, and a driver isn't just managing fatigue. They're managing solitude, parked alone in a sleeper berth lit only by a dashboard glow, and maybe that small therapy lamp. Fully aware that the oil camps at the end of the route are depending on whatever is sitting in that trailer arriving on schedule, regardless of what the sky outside is or isn't doing. That's the part of the story that tends to land hardest once people actually hear it. These drivers aren't choosing to work through polar night because the job demands a kind of toughness for its own sake. They're doing it because oil camps, drilling crews, and the communities connected to that infrastructure depend on a supply chain that genuinely cannot stop for 2 months, Just because the sun has, every load that reaches Deadhorse in the dead of January is, in a very direct sense, somebody's choice to keep functioning at -30 in total darkness, because the alternative is letting critical supply chains break down in a part of the world that has almost no backup option, if they do. Talk to drivers long enough and a quieter theme tends to surface. One that has less to do with the job itself and more to do with what the job asks of the people waiting at home. A driver based in Fairbanks might spend the better part of 2 months making runs north into a stretch of road where a phone call to family back home has to be timed around the brief windows where a satellite phone or a stop with working internet actually gives them a connection. Holidays, birthdays, an ordinary Tuesday dinner, all of it happens without them. In a darkness their own family back home isn't living through in the same way. Drivers describe the strange experience of finishing a run, walking back into a lit, ordinary house, and needing a day or two just to remember what it feels like for morning to actually look different from night. That adjustment period, brief as it sounds, is something almost nobody talks about when they imagine what this job costs the people who do it. By the time spring finally returns light to the North Slope, most of these drivers have spent 2 months adjusting their entire biology around a clock instead of a sky, leaning on lamps and curtains and a rigidly defended sleep schedule just to keep their judgment sharp enough to handle 400 miles of ice, mountain passes, and isolation in the dark. It's not the kind of survival story that gets told in dramatic terms, because nothing about it looks dramatic from the outside. It just looks like a truck, moving steadily through the dark, exactly on schedule, the way it has for decades. The next time you picture a long-haul trucker pulling an overnight shift, it's worth remembering that for some of them, on some routes, there isn't really a sunrise waiting at the end of it to mark the difference between day and night. There's just the next scheduled stop, the next 10 hours of mandated rest, and a lamp on the dashboard doing the job the sun usually does for free. Cold weather gets most of the attention when people imagine extreme trucking, and for good reason. But darkness that lasts for weeks, rather than hours, creates a survival problem most people have never even considered. One that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with how the human body keeps time. And cold and darkness are only 2 pieces of a much larger picture. Somewhere else on this same kind of map, drivers face an entirely different fight. One where the danger isn't the absence of light at all, but smoke thick enough to turn daylight into something just as blinding as any Arctic winter night, on routes where a wildfire can close in faster than a truck.